Okay, well, I guess we'll get started here. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, which is run by OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, and we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after this very short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then at the tail end of the webinar, we will have some time left over for questions that you will might have for the presenter. Before we get going here, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So first, for those of you who are dialing into the conference line, your lines have been automatically muted, and the reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions, feedback, etc. during the webinar. So if you'd like to ask a question during the discussion period, all you'll have to do is hit *6, and that will unmute your lines. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, just use this chat area to type your message, and I will try to help out as best as I can. As well, you can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for the presenter during the question and answer period, and then I can just read them out loud for everyone. I also wanted to mention that we are recording the webinar today. I should be sending out a copy of that to all those who have pre-registered, and we'll also be posting it on the Community of Practice website. And finally, I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACoP, is. So quickly before we start, I just wanted to mention that the FACoP is a sub-community, and it sits within a larger site, and it's called the Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, or the CCACoP. And the CCACoP is an interactive online community, and it provides a space where researchers, experts, and practitioners can come together to communicate with others who are also working in the field of climate change adaptation. This larger site is national in scope, and it currently hosts close to 600 members, made up of provincial and territorial employees, individuals from other levels of government, academia, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector. So the FACoP is a sub-community located within this larger site, so it's basically a site within a site, and it's dedicated to those members who are working in the forestry field or who are interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. It provides a private space where members can share information and best practices on current activities in the area of climate change, vulnerability, and adaptation in Canada's forest sector. And it's free to join, so if there's anyone on the line today who's interested in learning more about the FACoP or the CCACoP, you can contact Jason Edwards or myself, and our email addresses are in the chat box on the left there. So with that being said, I want to extend a warm welcome to Casey Macaulay, who has generously donated his time today to present this webinar for us, titled The Association of BC Forest Professionals 2013 Climate Change Awareness Survey, What Have We Learned and Where Are We Going? So the Association of BC Forest Professionals has initiated a task force to examine how professionals could be better guided in adapting practices to a changing climate. The outcomes of this are not yet known. However, the first step was to develop a baseline of climate change awareness within the profession. So in this presentation, Casey will review the key findings of the Climate Change Awareness Survey and will describe some of the strategies for moving forward. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Casey is a registered professional forester who joined the Association of BC Forest Professionals in 2011 as a resource operations specialist. This new role within the professional practice and forest stewardship department was designed to further the Association of BC Forest Professionals advocacy mandate, specifically relating to forest stewardship issues. Prior to this position, Casey was a planning forester for a major forest company in BC's southern interior. Past experiences include co-management of First Nation forest tenures, managing fiber trade agreements between licensees, developing operational strategies for species at risk, and working with various stakeholder groups that have other interests on the land base. Casey also administers the Stewardship Committee and the Climate Change Task Force, which are comprised of volunteer members and serve to provide recommendations to the CEO of the Association of BC Forest Professionals. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a big thank you to you, Casey, for taking time out of your day to present this webinar for us. It's very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Annette. Can everybody hear me all right there?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks again for the opportunity to present here today. We're fairly early on in our process here, but it's really excellent to have the opportunity to talk about some of the results we've got so far and showcase some of the great work that's going on in BC as well. So again, thanks to Jason as well for mentioning this opportunity and getting the ball rolling there. As well, a couple of the task force members, Cindy Pierce and Kathy Hopkins, who really brought some of the momentum towards our association and getting this off the ground. So wanted to mention them as well. So really this presentation is about our current efforts on climate change as an association. And I just want to touch on, I felt like I needed to touch on some of the work that's going on around BC just for context. Just so everybody knows, this is not my area of expertise, so I'm really speaking on behalf of that larger body of more knowledgeable people. And if you've browsed the slides, you'll see there's some examples there already. I wanted to provide those for context, and I'm not going to speak to them in any detail. If you have questions about it, I've tried to put hyperlinks in as much as possible so you can have a look at the work and then follow up with the authors of that work. So I just wanted to build that and kind of provide some flow to this presentation, starting off with who the association is, if you're from out of province in particular, and then what some of the work is going on, and then move into some of the survey results, which is really the bulk of what we want to cover today. And I think it's worth saying that climate change, however it takes its shape and however you interpret that, because there are different interpretations out there within the science, it does represent probably the single largest factor in planning and management of our future forests. So we really have to engage this one and build our understanding around it. So that's my lead in, and I'll move forward here. This is our task force here. These are the members, the contributors. Obviously other folks have contributed a lot to the knowledge base, but these are folks that I've been working with directly over the last few months. So I wanted to recognize them. I did misspell Dave's name. Sorry about that, Dave. They represent, the breadth and expertise within our membership, and a few of them are on the call today. So I just want to recognize them for the time they're putting in assisting the profession on this important initiative. So I won't spend too much time on who we are, but again, if you're not from BC, you may want a few bits there. Established in 1947, the first Foresters Act. As an association, we regulate the practice of professional forestry in BC. Approximately 5,500 members in a number of different member classes. Employed in a wide range of sectors. We've tended to talk about three main groups: government, industry, consulting, and academia, particularly in this context because we are dealing with a lot of research. The internally comprised of a council, our CEO, and our staff, and the membership. Together we are the ABCFP. And our mission statement is there, focusing on providing excellence in forest stewardship. So some bit of a discussion about the roles. This comes right out of our Act. Serve and protect the public's interest, enforcing the Foresters Act. Uphold the public interest, respecting the practice, and advocate and uphold principles of stewardship of forests, lands, resources, and ecosystems. And really that top duty there is the public interest. So when we look at what goes on in BC, this Act provides us quite an opportunity in the profession. Not all jurisdictions have this. And we look at the different roles there between the professional, say, licensees who have tenure rights, responsibilities. They're responsible for practices, and they work on the advice of professionals. But that advice, do they take it? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The majority of the time they do. The government is the overseer. I'm going to touch a little bit on our regulations and Act, the Forest and Range Practices Act, being results-based, measuring and monitoring that compliance. Those are some of the key roles within government. Just touching on our role in the climate change adaptation because the association's just stepped into this fairly recently. So our members are involved in all kind of activities that are going to be affected by climate change, and our survey starts to recognize that. Research, operation, silviculture, all those things that are part of the practice of professional forestry. Yeah, about a year ago at our council, our annual meeting, a number of members put a resolution forward to tackle climate change internally. And that's really the impetus for the Climate Change Task Force that I'll talk a little bit more about. I also wanted to highlight the principles of forest stewardship, which is something that our committees have worked on. You can go to the link there. There's 7 of them. We're really trying to bring these to the forefront of our thinking as well, and the clear linkages that they present to climate change and adaptation. I guess I would also say, our advocacy efforts like this, what we're doing today, it's member-driven, and a lot of times what we do comes through our membership, groups of members who feel that there's really things we need to be stepping up to the plate on. I also want to mention that the work of this task force, it goes back through a couple of our committees, and between those 2 committees, there's a practice committee and there's a stewardship committee. That brings the full weight of our act to those recommendations. So I think that's really important as well. Just talking about our policy framework very briefly, we have the Forest and Range Practices Act that came in a decade or so ago, very results-based. It's based on these 11 FERPA values, which I'll touch on in a minute. There's a series of regulations that flow from that. And another example of provincial legislation would be our Wildfire Act. Federally, obviously, we have federal legislation to manage within as well. So professionals need to be cognizant of all of these things. The summary statement there is the professional reliance piece. And there's been a large discussion about this over the last decade as we brought in a results-based code, is the reliance on the professionals, the decisions, the advice. They accept responsibility and can be held accountable for that decision. So that's an important piece of how things should operate in BC. However, it only works well when everyone understands what we mean by professional reliance. If we don't understand what that means, then the whole system doesn't function properly. It's worth noting that climate change is not part of our legislation at this time, so that's kind of the segue into the next slide. I bring this in because I think it's important to mention the context of what we do as professionals. Things like climate change come up. They're not really written down anywhere in terms of what should you do. I noticed this reference in Society of American Foresters referring to wicked problems, a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, changing requirements, things that are difficult to recognize. Our association has recognized that in the form of non-statutory expectations. You can go to the paper that overviews it, that came out last year. So that's expectations, conditions, circumstances held by others that a forest professional can achieve an outcome when no legislation or authority exists. And I think that's important to mention, not as an excuse for inaction, but it can be a barrier to us moving forward, maybe in your own office or sometimes even collectively. As well, the climate change it's a real challenge to professionals and policymakers. We've got moving goalposts and we've got some pretty big consequences as we look at these things, and not a lot of legal requirements to manage for it at this time. So what is going on in BC? And I think we'll probably have a large number of BC participants today, so this will be redundant for some of them. The first one would be pine beetle epidemic that we've lived through, warmer winters. And I'm really simplifying here, so just to I guess, make the contrast. Drought, we've seen increased fire frequency and severity. Rain on snow in the spring, we've seen increased flood severity and probably frequency as well. And then where we have a longer dry season, we have decreased stream flows, soil moisture, all of those things. Someone mentioned that it might be worth highlighting what's going on post-pine beetle epidemic, which is largely passed through BC at this time. And we see now that there's the degree and the vintage of that mortality really varies as you move north and south through the province. And we're reaching the later years of that salvage recovery effort. And that's why you're hearing so much today about our timber supply, our tenures, mill viability. The context is pine comprised over 30% of our interior timber profile. And in some areas it's much higher than that. So, you can see what a large driver that is to our activity today. The mills certainly learned how to adapt to that drier pine, but the markets did place limitations on what they could recover from that and what it was worth. As well, operators learned to adapt to a whole range of climate-driven influences. Besides just dry pine, they were dealing with things like early breakup, and they've had to work on improving stand merchandising with what they have residually in the stand. And we are seeing a large supply gap forming in most of our interior TSAs as a result of that pine beetle. There's some less obvious, more subtle indicators as well. Storm severity, more wind throw. Sometimes that's obvious, sometimes it's less obvious. In the low to mid elevations, we've seen snowpacks that are sometimes absent for most of the winter. So we get less seasonal moisture, particularly in the early season, which affects our fire season in the interior. As well, some of the research work on yellow cedar mortality on the coast has indicated that low snowpack allows frost to kill roots that historically we hadn't seen that. So it's resulting in some pretty large-scale mortality on the coast. Things like a delayed winter frost as well, that when the insects traditionally would get hit with that early in the winter, we don't see that as much now. Things like the changing, I'll show a slide a little bit further along that indicates some of the changes in the temperature and precipitation regimes in certain parts of the province. In this case, has shown that it leads to needle blight, and that's been quite devastating in younger pine stands. So the question is climate change, is it changing faster than some forest ecosystems are capable of adapting? I think that's what's in the back of everyone's minds. Obviously, species ranges move quite slowly, either elevationally or in latitude over time. And the question is, how quickly are those externalities and factors moving? So I threw this one in there around the debate because we'll touch on it a bit in our survey responses. Some debate the causes and magnitude of future change. However, and I can attest to this in the work I've been doing, most scientists and forest professionals agree the climate is changing and we need to adapt. And I put the little equation in there, good stewardship is adaptive, and that represents best practices. The sample slide in here is fairly dramatic. It represents some research that was done in the central part of BC. And this is the work that's led up to some of the findings on Dothis roma and needle blight. So you can click on that and have a look if you would like to. Again, I can't attest to the details within this research, so if it's something you want to follow up on, please do. Another example here, this is a big one, is some of the consensus projections on our ecosystem mapping. So the work that was done here, Tong Lee provided this slide, so thanks for that. It was also made a point to me that the link at the bottom points to a different reference. So I think the Climate BC map will take you to the graphic that you see there, but I just wanted to point that out. So this work took 20 different scenarios, change scenarios and took the work from the IPCC and put it together to indicate some of the shifts that we may expect to see in those biogeoclimatic envelopes. So that's really important work in terms of looking at species, ranges, and a whole host of other activities. In BC, a lot of our systems are tied to our biogeoclimatic mapping. It's really been a critical part of our forest management. So another one that someone suggested as well, this comes out of Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium on snowpack trends. And I won't speak to it, but you can see, have a look at the graphic or go and have a look at the work that was done there as well. Some other research as I was looking through and preparing here, there's some work on fire that's brand new coming out of Ontario on fire ignition. And it's linked to climate change and or early detection and detection technologies as well. And some of the stuff in BC relates to distribution of spruce and Douglas fir forest. That's brand new research that's come out as well. And then some of the stuff that's been around for a couple of years on assisted migration of western larch. And that's starting to flow into our stalking standards as well here in BC. So the term vulnerability is something that's come up a lot. And I just wanted to touch on it as well. It's kind of an equation when you look at it. It's a function of climate, adaptive capacity, degree of exposure. And when we talk about vulnerability assessments and some of the work that's being done or proposed, it's important to recognize what this term is. And the context that I want to put it in is within the resource values that we've assigned through our provincial legislation. So we have these 11 resource values within the Forest and Range Practices Act. This is just an excerpt from their website. And they have a monitoring program to look at all of these resource values and monitor how they change from practices and climate changes within that as well. So, but I don't want to confuse that monitoring program with some of the other vulnerability assessment work that's going on as well. This is just one example. I borrowed this next slide from one of my task force members. I'm not sure if he got it from somewhere else, but this just kind of maps out how we would evaluate that vulnerability process. In this case, linking back to those forest and range values, the 11 values. So I thought it was a nice way to graphically represent how we can look at that in terms of natural adaptation or management response. Some of the regional work that's been done, and the next slide will have some links for you to it. The Nadina Forest Districts, the West Kootenays have both done regional assessments like this. We've also seen them used for specific resources like wetlands or old growth. So who's working on it? There's a lot going on, a lot of really good work. This isn't an exhaustive list, and if I left something you're aware of off of there, I apologize for that. But these are certainly some of the prominent programs that are going on. So make sure you have a look at those. As I was preparing for this, I was really impressed with the breadth of work that's going on out there. So the task force, just want to speak briefly about that before we get into the survey results. We set an objective out that forest professionals will be guided in adapting practices in a changing climate. So we've got quite a diverse group of members. We have a couple of non-members as well. That came together in November. And we pulled them together based on their expertise or strong interest and prior communications that they've had with us about it. And I'd like to recognize the work of the Future Forest Ecosystem Scientific Council, because they really brought those people together and created that community. So some of our priority areas are the survey, which we'll jump into right away. Collaboration with agencies and other professions. That's something that's going on parallel to this right now. Linking research to on-the-ground practices. So compiling resources that influence people's practice. Develop and share those best practices and look at future guidance around this too. And then what are the opportunities for workshops within that? The government just finished a series of them that we participated in. That's a great way to get people engaged. And we also want to recognize the innovators in our membership, regionally, provincially, and we're looking at an award that would allow us to do that. So the survey itself, this was the first recommendation of the task force. Right when we got started, they said, hey, let's survey the membership and get an understanding of where everybody is at. Because really up to that point, it's conjecture as to where professionals sit on various climate change issues. We had a pretty good response here, 26%, which to some people sounds low. But in terms of surveying a population or a membership, that's a good response rate. And I think it reflects that our members are really quite interested in the topic. Technically speaking, for those interested, we use fluid surveys. Cost was really minimal. We do a lot of survey work to service our business plan and so on. It is the first climate survey we've done. And the questions were proposed mostly by our task force members. We wanted to keep it short and we wanted to focus on awareness. First question, looking at employer groups. And I wanted to point out, someone reviewing this said, you know, your bars there on your chart may not be exactly proportional to your percentages. That could be just a formatting when I brought it into the presentation. So make sure you look at the percentage field in all of these and use the real number. This is pretty consistent with our membership profile, 40% in government, 22% industry. That's pretty reflective of who's out there and practicing. We had about 1,500 responses when the final poll came in. What region do you work in? This is a slightly better distribution than our membership profile, which for the purpose of this survey is really good. We're getting good regional response from around the province. So the first question's kind of multifaceted, looking at taking stock of current knowledge, indicate your level of agreement. So the questions are really just designed to gauge where the membership is at with respect to these different points of view. And you can see in about 63% are in agreement or strong agreement with our first statement on climate change is faster now than it has changed for millennia. And some of these statements, might get people kind of excited. But as you move down through them here, we look at number 2. We have 71% in agreement with the current pace of climate change significantly affected by emissions of CO2. Number 3, we'd have 74% in that. So that trend is pretty consistent through those first questions. And obviously we do have a cohort there that does not agree with those statements. But as we get down further, we see we got 84% in the 5th question, that it's important to consider climate change in the management of forests. So getting good recognition there. The last questions, we have 47% are not really certain about where to find information. And this is consistent with a later slide that we'll see as well. 69% aren't certain about their ability to assess risks. So this really speaks to some gaps that we see at the front end of this process. Next slide is observations about where you identify threats to BC forests in a changing climate and what you've observed. So insects and disease, number 1. Wildfires in 2nd place. This isn't an exhaustive list, so people were able to make some other suggestions as well. The other thing that folks mentioned, a number of the comments came in and said, well, you're talking about threats, but what about potential benefits from it? And that's something I think research will start to pull out over time. But some folks feel like, look, let's not focus on all the negatives about climate change. Maybe there's some some good things that we'll realize from it as well. So barriers. What are the largest barriers? So we see vision, policy, guidance, no authority to make those decisions, and then we also see knowledge, expertise, and ability coming into that as well. I think this is consistent with other work I've seen on climate change, asking similar questions. It reflects the rapid pace of change and the struggle to maintain knowledge, capacity, standards. We were pleasantly surprised to see that this really lines up with where we were planning to put our efforts with the task force. So, we hope to address some of these things as best as we can over the next year or two. Do you have the appropriate level of training needed? So this represents a gap for sure. It can assist with our advocacy work, though. It highlights that professionals aren't alone in this. So some folks might feel like, look, I don't know what's going on here. I'm feeling a bit lost. Obviously, a bunch of other people are having similar feelings at this point in time. So I think what really is, we need to develop this expertise. We need to link research with practice. The next question is, who should be doing this training? Because we've seen extension services drop off over the last decade. A lot of these things did not survive through the recession. So training capacity is something we need to rebuild as we start to work on these concepts. So what practices are you undertaking? So this is kind of the good news, bad news slide, as I put it. So there's a lot of folks that are doing things that are adaptive, from regeneration field trials, shifting programs around within their season. I guess if you wanted to call it the bad news part, is 46% aren't doing anything that we suggested. So we take this and we say, look, we need to start identifying good practices. We need to share those successes. And like the old statement, we can't keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result. But there were some nice examples that were brought forward in the comments to that one. So do you seek out professionals with specialized knowledge to advise plans and decisions? And we've got a pretty good distribution here. Quite a few people are saying, I never do that. I just want to recognize that while we don't have a lot of this specialized knowledge, we do have excellent experience, people who recognize what's going on within their area of operations. And we started asking folks where and what they've done in the past with field trials, different work that they've done to recognize and try some different practices. That's been already going on for many, many years. I think there's some hidden gems in there that we can find. And we just need to do that follow-up work collectively and share that knowledge, however experimental it might be. So employers' awareness, not too bad, but recognize 40% of the respondents came out of government, and government's fairly strong on this stuff. So I think a bit more analysis in the survey can show us where those numbers are a little more clearly. We do, as an association, we engage employers and stakeholders in our survey work, particularly when we're talking about stewardship advocacy. So that's a place we can ask questions and build awareness over time as well. Does your employer have a plan? I think this is something that could be improved on, just following up with that last slide. It does reflect current or past range of awareness or lack of clarity on trends and risks. But businesses are really starting to evaluate the risk that climate change presents. And someone just forwarded along, the Royal Bank of Canada just put out a flyer recently talking about business risks from climate change. So I think we're seeing those conversations starting to happen more and more. So some conclusions that I kind of drew out of this. there is room for increased awareness of climate change concepts. We saw that with the government workshops, the adaptation workshops that were run in the spring. People are really hungry for knowledge. They want to start to see trends within that, so they can start to think more clearly about this. Practitioners are already finding techniques to adapt. That's already happening. The policy, vision, guidance, standards, that is probably those are the biggest obstacles right now to moving forward. Professionals need room to innovate within the policy framework. We get some feedback that folks are concerned they can't respond the way they would like. So I think that's something that we need to look at, and we know government is looking at that. We need more go-to experts who can link research and practice. And I think more employers could benefit from having their own action plans as well. That's going to empower employees and professionals further. And adaptation does look different as you move around the province, as do the climate change trends that we're projecting. And it's, because this came up in our survey, there is some reluctance around the climate science as well. So I think that's something, the survey really shows that we have a bell curve within our membership. We have folks who are less engaged through to more engaged. We have folks who are, more to less satisfied or in agreement with the work that's going on. So the responses do indicate that. So some folks are a bit troubled about the IPC science, for instance, or the focus on what they believe to be short-term trends in climate. Key messages, these are some things we developed quite early on as we put the task force together, but we believe we have to develop an ongoing awareness on this. There is enough data available to begin pursuing adaptation. We must manage for uncertain future conditions. As an association, we want to advocate and support policies that lead to improved adaptation. And we certainly support things like this where governments, industry, researchers, we all get together and we talk about this and we bring solutions forward and we kick them around. Particularly in an era of constrained resources, this type of collaborative work is really important. So next steps, some of the work that we're actively doing with the task force, reviewing relevant research papers, trying to find those linkages to practice, because there's a lot of information out there, but not all of it is digestible for practitioners. We want to look at how we share that within our membership via our website. We want to foster that innovation and the sharing of those best practices and that knowledge. Regionally is probably the best way to go, because it really does work differently in different parts of BC. It's a very diverse province. And look at, do we need specific guidance? And if so, consistent with the past guidance that we've offered as well. We want to collaborate with other agencies and professional associations, and that's something that's going on right now through West Coast environmental law. And advocate for policy and legislation that enables professionals to adapt and be accountable. So, that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I want to note, though, that the BC ministries have shown a lot of leadership on this over the past 5 years or so. The Chief Forester recognized the risks involved and started to put some of the initial programs together that we've seen. We've had the benefit, if you want to call it that, of being in front in line with the mountain pine beetle and seeing these devastating effects and recognizing that there may be some other things out there that are coming up and we need to be aware of them. And so even though we've struggled to provide continued funding for some of these things, there's a community of people in and out of government who continue to work on it. And these partnerships are really critical, as are policies that reflect the dynamics of the forest ecosystems. So we need to break down those barriers, whether it's awareness, employer, policy, or practice, because our profession is really based on that sound science. And even if folks are cautious, as a group we tend to be long-term thinking, and we need to be long-term in thinking. So I think that is all I have to say, and we'll open it up for questions on that at this point.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks so much, Casey. So yeah, let's jump right into the question and answer period. So I think we have about 20 minutes or so left for discussion. So again, if you'd like to use the chat box to ask your question, feel free and go ahead and type your question. However, if you're on the conference line with us, just a reminder to hit *6 to unmute your line and just pipe up and ask your question. So is there anybody on the line with us that would like to ask Casey a question? Anybody at all? Okay, well, I have a question just to, get things started here, Casey. So how is the ABCFP planning to work with other professional organizations to address climate change?
Yeah, that's a good one, and we're seeing it take shape right now. West Coast Environmental Law, and I have one of their links in our slides, recently hosted quite a number of the professional associations in BC in their office to discuss what are some of the common goals, what are some of the challenges, what are some of the barriers, how do we work together as professional groups and bring, whether it's barriers, whether it's concerns, bring those through at the provincial level, or some common ways of talking to our membership. So really, I think at this point that's in its infancy, but we're going to see that it's a growing thing, and it provides a lot of momentum around it by having those groups working together.
Okay, thank you. So Christine Callahoo has a question on the chat box here. So she says, thank you very much, great overview. And in the light of confines of the Foresters Act and the mandate of the ABCFP, would the primary focus of next steps be to address the legislative allowances more specifically, providing ABCFP members the legislative ability to incorporate climate change adaptation into their practice?
I'm just reading that over again. So legislative allowances, that's one of the next steps. I would say primary focus, I don't know, we've got 3 or 4 areas of focus being working on practices internally, sharing information. In terms of legislation, we may advocate for changes that give them more ability to adapt. For instance, there's a lot of discussion around the tolerances within stocking standards. And stocking standards are something that's, folks incorporate into their forest stewardship plans. And we've seen kind of a toing and froing around how much flexibility we can have within those. So yeah, I think, we can work on pieces of that, but as a whole, that provincial legislation is something that it's large, and we all need to work on it together. It's probably not realistic that the task force is going to pull that apart too much.
Okay, and Christine just had another note from a professional risk perspective and the incorporation of parameters beyond general practice. Okay, so Pamela has a question. So how can professionals ensure sound science gets implemented in the face of counterproductive political decisions? For example, meeting social economic pressures for timber supply, which can conflict with more precautionary-based management decisions.
How can professionals ensure sound science gets implemented? I think it's really profiling it. I know talking to the folks in the Future Forests group, there was some frustration there that this information's being collected. There's great work. There's trends. We need folks to embrace it. I think that's the awareness piece. It's workshops. It's talking to peers. It's getting it out there, and it's letting professionals know that they have that independent opportunity. Now, there's obviously confines in how licensees or employers interact with government in terms of that legal relationship. But within that, professionals have the opportunity to incorporate new ideas and science into their work. And sometimes I don't think they realize they're on a path of here's how we do forestry or here's how I do this practice. But they have freedom within that to incorporate new information, try some things on various sites, and start to work with communities of people. We have members who are really excellent at doing that. So I think it's an awareness piece more than anything.
Okay, thanks, Casey. Dirk Brinkman has a question here. He says, thanks for the overview. And were there any suggestions from members that truly represented benefits of climate change? He says, I have heard many facile comments about warmer winters, but virtually no serious ideas.
Yeah, I would concur with Dirk. I think what folks are wondering about is, will we have increased productivity? Will we have more rainfall or soil moisture in areas that we haven't before that will enable us to, to grow trees faster or grow a greater diversity or get other benefits from the forest ecosystem? I wouldn't rule those out. I don't think anyone's ruling them out. But I think we see a lot more risk associated with these trends than we do see benefits at this time. The folks who make those comments are the ones who are a bit cynical about the science as well. At least those are some of the trends I saw in the survey.
Okay, thanks, Casey. I guess I'll ask anyone on the line if anybody has a question, just please hit *6 and ask away. If not, then Nancy Houle has a question in the chat box here. So thanks for the presentation. Curious as to who is on your task force, just forestry professionals, or does it include other resource professionals, stakeholders, etc.?
Good question. Yeah, we've got of the dozen or so folks, there's probably about 9 of them are members. Some of them are joint members of other associations, engineering, biology. We have Harry Nelson, who's a kind of our link to UBC and the work that's going on there. And we've incorporated a grad student recently as well, but not specifically with stakeholders would be the short answer to that. It is mostly focused on the folks who are doing the work and want to get these messages out to our membership.
Perfect, thanks. Last call for questions on the conference line. Everyone's quiet today. Anybody on the chat box? I'll give you a couple more seconds here before we wrap things up.
Yeah, and if you want to share my email, that's fine. Annette, if folks want to email me with some other more detailed questions.
Yes, I have it ready to go here. So just posted Casey's email, so feel free to email him any further questions that you might have. So I guess with that being said, we'll wrap things up here since there doesn't seem to be any more questions. So thanks again, everyone, for joining the webinar today. Hope you enjoyed it, and obviously a very big thank you goes out to you, Casey, for your time and effort and for a great presentation. So any last comments from you before we sign off here?
No, I see somebody might be typing. I don't know if that's a question or not, but no, I just want to thank everyone for joining this call, and I think it's great to see this community across Canada, because there's a lot of great research that applies interprovincially as well. So there are a couple questions on, do you want me to answer that last one?
Yeah, I think Ramon Sales has one last question here. So is downscaled climate data adequate or available to provide the basis for sound forest adaptation planning at the local scale?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer that one. I'm fairly new to this body of research work, and I've heard about the downscaling and some of the concerns about it. I will say that it's going to depend regionally where you're trying to downscale it to. Some of the work, like we look at it, is provincial in scale, and some of it is when we look at ecosystem mapping in certain parts of the province, projecting that forward, there probably is, say, good confidence over the next 20 to 50 years in what might be happening. And as a result of that, look at some of the adaptation that might be involved there. But obviously that's something we have to be very careful about, downscaling broader trends and trying to run away with them for your area of operations. I think that's where we need to develop that expertise and that linkage between practitioner and researcher to be able to have those conversations and discuss the risks involved with doing it.
Okay, great, thanks. And yes, Jason is right. We will start a discussion forum on the FACoP for people to share thoughts and ideas on the presentation as well. So I guess one last call out for questions before we wrap up. Nope. Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer things after the fact, or I don't know that I answered that first question really well, so if Christine wants to follow up, I would be happy to do that.
Okay, great. And yes, your email is right there for anyone that would like to email Casey after, get in touch. Okay, well, I guess with that being said, we'll wrap things up here. So again, thanks everyone for joining and have a great week.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.